happen. Well, okay, so that's perhaps enough about the point of view of straight science, because I doubt there are very many people in this room who are actually practice that kind of science. A point that should be made about reality that comes slightly closer to the experience of each of us is, for society to work, for reality, always in quotes, to work, we have to assume that we are sharing the same reality. And there are different levels on which this assumption operates. For instance, many of you have heard me talk about the slippery vicissitudes of language, that in fact we are communicating, we are most in agreement when we are silent with each other, because then our assumptions about how we're in agreement are able to fully unfurl themselves. But all it takes is somebody breaking that silence and stating the contents of their mind for the assumption of our shared reality to completely collapse upon us. Because it turns out, I think it's one way, you think it's another, I believe we're doing X, you think we're doing Y, I think we're serving so-and-so, and you think we're serving somebody else. And this is why, I think great relationships are built in silence, because then nobody ever finds out what's really going on. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, when you're talking about science, are you talking about science, the kind of science where in order for it to be science you have to repeat, in a certain situation has to be repeated and you have to get the same response so that proves out to be a truth?
Well, yeah, that's a good definition of science.
So that when you're talking about reality in the moment, that never proves out true, because if you're in that artistic moment, then you never get a repetition. You're getting a synchronicity where your reality is in tune with a flow that the words I use is like miraculous. That people start showing up when I need them to chop, and it's when I let go of my ego and my need for a specific thing that flow starts to happen. And in a scientific world, you need the same thing repeated several times in order to get it to be a truth.
That's right. A good definition of science, not one that any scientist would be comfortable with. They think they're doing God's work or something. But the fact of the matter is, what science is the study of those phenomena so crude that a return to initial conditions will cause the phenomenon to repeat itself. Well, if you think about your own life, there's nothing like that in your own life. Love affairs, careers, disappointments, nothing that we experience as human beings has that quality. So science, this is the problem with science, is that in the pursuit of explanation, it has cut itself off absolutely from making sense of anything in our own lives. That's why in efforts by science to move into the domains of our own lives have not been happy. Sciences like psychology and sociology are pseudosciences, as far as I'm concerned, because the objects they seek to explicate, personalities in one case and human group interaction in another, are not scientific phenomena, because they don't fall under the rubric of restoration of initial conditions allows the same situation to unfold. But I want to point out, go further than this. Well, first of all, let me say one more thing about that.
Maybe what you just said is not quite true, because if you were able to provide the whole set of same initial conditions, which is impossible to provide, but if you were able to provide exactly the same circumstances, there is a chance that may happen. The problem is that you're not able to understand what all the initial conditions are.
No, I think that since the invention of the probability calculus, that's not even believed anymore. In other words, the idea used to be that if you think of the universal history as a film, that if you ran it back to the beginning and then hit the start button again, everything will happen exactly like it happened before, and I will be born in poor but humble circumstances in a Colorado mining town, and it will. But I think now the understanding is that only generally would the same things happen, and that even in orthodox science, probability allows for slight deviation from. So it isn't an absolute determinism.
Well, I don't believe that, because my feeling is that what we are just saying is that we don't understand what's happening, and the probability is just saying, more or less, I guess that it's going to be around there. I just have some idea of what's happening, but it's saying, I'm not understanding the process really well, and therefore I can guide you approximately where you're going.
So do you think that if we could return to the initial conditions of the Big Bang and have it happen again, that 5 billion years later I would be sitting here with the same amount of change in my pocket as I have right now?
I don't believe that we could do that.
Well, you brought it up.
We could go back to the Big Bang and be back there. But what I'm saying is that the fact that you're saying that if you go back to the same initial conditions, then it's going to reproduce itself, that statement is not true. It's not true either.
Well, see, the problem is there's only one set of initial conditions that are truly initial, which is the Big Bang. All other sets of initial conditions are embedded in some larger surround where everything has changed. I mean, for instance, if we say, we can never restore initial conditions. The planets have moved. The stars are older. How can we restore the initial conditions? Everything only happens once, and then it never repeats itself. But I'm plowing toward this thing. But I want to say one more thing. I'll subvert myself. That is, in order to do its work, science had to, and this happened with Descartes, it had to take the things that are most dear to us, colors, taste, feeling, tactility, and it defined those things as what it calls secondary qualities. Basically, this is a way of saying they're not important. None of that is important. And what is important are primary qualities: spin, velocity, angular momentum, charge. Strangely enough, things none of us have a very intuitive grasp of, nor do we ever encounter these things in any naked form. They're always embedded in matter. So science, in order to do its work, basically had to define the universe of feeling, emotionality, and immediacy as somehow peripheral, derivative, epiphenomenal, unimportant. And we all live with this legacy, unconsciously or consciously. We are the victims of this kind of denigration of what we intuitively feel to be important, which is immediate experience. And immediate experience is not an object for scientific inquiry. Never has been, never will be. I mean, these pseudosciences fiddle with it a little bit, but the first thing they do when they study, for instance, human behavior, is they don't study, they set up an experimental situation, which is not like any human behavior you've ever dealt with before, like either, looking at screens and pushing buttons or receiving electric shocks if you get right answers and stuff like that. I mean, how many times do we find ourselves in a situation where if we get a right answer, we avoid an electric shock? I mean, it's absurd. However, then, there is a further distancing from reality that takes place that is not to be laid at the feet of science, although to discuss it we have to use scientific terminology. And that is, it goes like this. We all assume that if we are... I just stated what a great thing silence was for building shared assumptions. So if we are all silent and we look around us in this room, we do tend to make the assumption that we all see the same thing, that we are all sharing the experience of the room. But when you analyze perception, you discover a very weird thing about perception. For instance, let's take the primary sense in human beings, which is sight. We trust our eyes. We believe that that our eyes tell us something about immediate reality. However, if you analyze what sight is, what seeing is, it's that light reflected off surfaces pours into a sensory organ and then is transduced through a series of neurological transforms into an interiorized model of the immediate surround. The problem with this is that the light which enters my eyes is entirely mine. You don't get any of it. And the light which enters your eyes is entirely yours. Not a single photon is ever shared by two people. If it's my photon, it can't be yours, because photons can only be in a very discretely defined area of space, in this case, in my retina. So everything I'm seeing is entirely opaque to you, hidden, occult, and everything you're seeing is entirely opaque and hidden to me. We are truly prisoners of our unique perception. So it's a miracle that we can build models where we get any sort of shared consensus out of it at all.
Terence, may I say something?
Sure. You're driving the tape editor mad.
Because you can turn this around, because the twin photon experiment shows, in fact, that there's no way that a photon can be considered as an individual object. I mean, what the experiment demonstrates is that every photon fills the entire universe.
Well, it demonstrates it by the fiat of a fishy formula, don't you think?
No, I think it's
well, why not?
How do you explain the interference pattern?
Well, I think that explaining it, it's not really explainable in the sense of, if you mean how do you reduce it to a linear logic, you don't. It's pretty mysterious.
Yeah, well, it does come out of a linear. I mean, it ends up you have to assume that the photon goes through both slits, and you get the interference pattern as a linear superposition of the. So it is, in a sense, linear. But what I would argue is, since a photon is not a little particle, it's something else. I mean, at least one of its properties is that it fills the entire universe and can interfere. One could understand that we're all receiving, in fact, the same photon. Every photon that goes in my eye goes in everybody else's eye.
Well, but when you say it fills the entire universe, it fills some parts of the universe much more than others.
That's the probability.
Yes, and that's what gives it its particulate nature, is that it tends, it is technically everywhere, but it's only technically everywhere. In any practical sense, whenever we carry out a measurement on it, and seeing is a kind of collapse of this quantum vector, then it appears to be particulate.
That's absolutely right. We've only ever observed photons as particulate, but the effects we observe, like the interference pattern, is not particulate. You can't explain it in terms of...
That's right.
So even though that photon that goes through your eyes mostly goes through yours, and only a little bit goes through mine, you can't ignore the bit that goes through mine, because there are lots and lots of examples of quantum...
But don't you think that the experiments which prove this kind of thing are depend on such a vast chain of assumptions that the experiment itself becomes highly questionable. I mean, first of all, the first assumption that's made that is absolutely outside the realm of proof is that mathematics has something to say about reality. And we could actually have spent the entire evening on this, except that it probably would clear the room of all but the most hardcore. But no one has ever shown why operations with numbers, which are, after all, entities only met with in the confines of the minds of anthropoid apes, should somehow have this overwhelming relationship to reality. What is the relationship of mathematics to what we call reality? The fact is, nobody knows. It's a deep mystery. Well, then when you talk about experiments, the assumptions, the hidden assumptions behind any experimentalist approach are usually so great that once made explicit, the experimental method is seen to be simply the servant of a formal theory and can't be seen to serve truth at all. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, but that's what you end up facing is the fact that it's our concepts that are creating the reality. And so even the assumption that there's a surface out there that's reflecting light is not an assumption that a physicist would make. Because
yeah, well,
if we made that assumption, we couldn't get anywhere. I mean, it just doesn't work.
That's right. Down. I think the purpose of this evening is to show that reality is a naive concept and should probably be abandoned as quickly as possible.
Well, reality from this, what I hear is reality from a standpoint of physical explanations, which seem like red herrings in some way to me, is that if there's, speaking from sort of what would be a more spiritual viewpoint, that sort of the physical plane and things, matter and everything falls out from more archetypical or something that has a less or more spiritual meaning, which I don't have so much a reality problem with. In other words,
that seems more real to you, this invisible dimension of eternal objects that are casting a lower dimensional shadow into the stream of time and giving rise to appearances.
Yeah, that's what you wanted to do.
Took the words right out of this.
Yeah, the experience.
Well, I think this is why Greek philosophy was able to do business so successfully, is that this seems intuitively true to most people. It's sort of like campfire philosophy. If you just sit down and try to figure it out, there's something in the human mind. I mean, I suppose it's self-referential if we call it archetypes, but there's something in the human mind that causes us to gravitate toward this Platonic point of view. The problem is it's very naive, and the naivete of Platonism has never seemed to erode its success. I mean, it's been converting sophomores for 3,000 years almost. But in a way, the great victory of modern thinking, and I'm amazed to hear myself say this because I'm a Platonist through and through, but you have to be a modified Platonist or you will end up running up against impossible problems with it. For instance, if these archetypes are eternal, well then what was there? If the archetype of the human love affair is eternal, then are we asked to believe that the archetype of the human love affair existed before the Big Bang? Did the law of gene segregation exist before the Big Bang? This is what Rupert's always at such pains to talk about. Natural laws. I mean, what is the status of these natural laws before the appearance of the universe? Is there a kind of hyperspace of eternity? And then why are these natural laws as they are? It seems much more economical and intuitively less problem-fraught to assume that the so-called laws of nature are actually habits of nature that are changing through time as the universe evolves and changes. And I mean, I don't think it makes any sense to talk about the law of gene segregation before there was organic life. I mean, how could there be a law of gene segregation? I mean, it just gets too patched together as a theory, don't you think?
No, I think that you're introducing. Those are loaded problems that you're to talk about the Big Bang as itself. And the whole time and etc.
Well, what do you think the status of these archetypes is? Do they require a universe, or are they there whether there is a universe of space, time, and matter?
I don't know.
Well, it seems that that's only a problem if you're thinking of time in a normal type of progression and normal types of causal relationships. So it seems that's to refute the idea of an eternal archetype because of, do they exist before this?
So you want to substitute a Boolean logic here. Well, we could say, for instance, we could invert the causality of the universe and say that the Platonic objects exist at the end of time and that they cast their influence backwards through time. And we could even define an archetype as that class of objects whose casuistry runs counter to the ordinary arrow of time. I never thought of that before. It's probably fraught with epistemic peril, but somebody might want to work out the consequences of that. It's the idea, you see, that is now very hot in chaos theory, that there is an attractor rather than an impeller. That it isn't that there was a Big Bang and everything is moving out from the Big Bang and physics is the unraveling of the consequences of this initial improbability. It's rather the idea that there is a telos of some sort, a purpose that is drawing phenomena into some kind of concrescence that occurs not at the beginning of the causal process, but at its end. And I tend to lean toward that, but not in so hard a fashion that I would want to locate the archetypes at the end of history. I think, I think Platonism is a naive view of reality, and that it's something we pass through in our intellectual process of maturation, and that you always want to maintain the idea of the archetype, but it has to be severely modified to meet some of the problems that have been discovered in the last couple of thousand years of doing that kind of philosophy. Sure, go ahead. If it's
things that based on altered states that I've been in, where returning to a more ordinary state, I have the sense clearly that everything is all this material, all the events, and everything is a fallout from some drama that I'm a part of. All my ideas, including, whatever I might construct about time and the whole thing. And so then I'm left with that sort of quandary about no matter what I construct and what experiments might do if I were a physicist, it's all to just confirm this other drama that's happening. That happens an infinite number of times and with infinite variations, etc.
Sort of the point that I would like to make is that is the point you're making, that reality is, if explored at all, if stressed, if pushed, it breaks apart. The concept isn't viable. The first thing to realize is, where is it writ large that anthropoid apes should be able to reach the bedrock of reality? Why should we imagine that beings like ourselves are somehow divinely charged with the opportunity to perceive the truth of the matter? This is what modern philosophy has come to understand. This is why Wittgenstein could come up with the notion of what he called true enough. That's a much more reasonable approach to things. I mean, after all, we're monkeys. And so what we need is models that are true enough, and leave God alone in his or her heaven and just work with the things that are rationally apprehendable to us. You mention altered states. And I think if it weren't for altered states, our epistemic naivete would be much greater, because we could all just fall into the culturally sanctioned hallucination that this is in fact reality. But we all know from experiencing altered states that this is just some kind of agreed upon, socially sanctioned construct, that when you lean against it with drugs or philosophy or insight, it breaks up under the pressure of that. What we really are, what we call reality, is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination of some sort. And we can go outside of that hallucination, either by using drugs or physical practices like yoga, or simply by going outside of our reality. I mean, when you go to an Amazon tribe, all these things that you think are so important, you know, how the giants are doing, or what's happening on Wall Street, or how the Democrats are getting their act together. Nobody knows what in the world you're talking about. It is literally not real. And what's real is, how the fish are spawning in the river and honey production that year. They have their own culturally sanctioned hallucination. Well, then when you take psychedelic drugs, you seem to dissolve the software of neurological processing, and language is that software that has been created to handle certain kinds of cultural modalities. Well, then you penetrate beyond the screen, if you want to use a computer metaphor, and instead you discover there's assembly language in the machine, and it's deep in the machine and is rarely encountered except by hackers. I mean, that's what you're doing when you're taking psychedelic drugs, is you're opening the cabinet. You're going into the machinery, all those areas where it says the warranty will be voided if you remove this plate. Those are the plates that you're unscrewing and poking inside of, voiding the warranty on your model of reality.